Welcome back. You're still watching The Globe. 95% of the people in Afghanistan don't have enough to eat, whilst 9 million people are at risk of famine. This is according to the United Nations Secretary General, who was speaking at the start of a virtual donor conference seeking to create momentum towards the $4.4 billion that the UN says it needs to fund humanitarian efforts in the country. The appeal to date has only reached 13% of the funds required. Antonio Guterres has called on the international community to find ways to spare the Afghan people from the decision to halt development support to Afghanistan and the freezing of some $9 billion in Afghan assets held abroad.
The humanitarian appeal for Afghanistan is the largest ever launched for a single country, but commitments to date are lagging the desperate needs on the ground.
Despite our collective efforts, the already dire humanitarian situation in Afghanistan has deteriorated alarmingly over the past months. Some 95% of people do not have enough to eat, and 9 million people are at risk of famine. UNICEF estimates that 1 million severely malnourished children are on the verge of death without immediate action, and global food prices are skyrocketing as a result of the war in Ukraine. This spells catastrophe for both Afghans struggling to feed their families and for our aid operations. Without immediate action, we face a starvation and malnutrition crisis in Afghanistan.
The Food and Agricultural Organization says households in the country are resorting to measures such as skipping meals, selling agricultural livelihoods, or taking on debt to ensure there's food on the table, as the UN aims to reach some 22 million people in need.
The UN Development Programme has warned that unless we take action, 97% of Afghans could be living below the poverty line by the middle of this year. Humanitarian needs have tripled since last June. Yes, tripled. And they are growing, day by day, month by month. Excellencies, the international community must find ways to spare the Afghan people from the impact of the decision to halt development support to Afghanistan and to freeze nearly $9 billion in Afghan assets overseas. It must make cash available so the Afghan economy can breathe and the Afghan people can eat.
The global organization has clarified that all funds raised go directly to aid agencies implementing humanitarian projects and not through the Taliban that now governs Afghanistan, and comes at a time when the de facto rulers backtracked on a commitment to allow girls to attend school beyond the 6th grade, further complicating international goodwill.
I deeply regret the girls' education above 6th grade remains suspended, a violation of the equal rights of girls that damages the entire country and leaves girls more exposed to violence, poverty, and exploitation. There is simply no justification for such discrimination. Educated girls become educated women who lift their families and communities into a better future. The inclusion of women and girls in all sectors of society and the economy is essential to overcoming Afghanistan's intersecting economic, humanitarian, and human rights crises. I call on those with influence to use it to pressure the de facto authorities to fulfill their promise to reopen schools for all students without discrimination or further delay.
In a world of multiple crises where humanitarians are being stretched to the limit. From Afghanistan to Ukraine to the Sahel and the Horn of Africa to the DRC, Yemen and elsewhere, the UN's Office for Humanitarian Affairs says some 274 million people will need humanitarian assistance and protection this year alone. A significant increase from the 235 million just a year ago, driven by man-made conflicts, a climate crisis and disease, with women and girls bearing the brunt. Sherman Briceby's SABC News, New York.
Well, for more on this humanitarian crisis, we're now joined by Hassan Choonara, who's Regional Director for Africa Muslim Agency. Hassan, thanks very much indeed for joining us. You know, we've just heard this disturbing report from Sherman Briceby's. From what you've seen and what you've heard, just how bad are things on the ground in Afghanistan?
Well, Peter, thank you for having us again. And, just having returned from Afghanistan 2 weeks ago, having spent 8 days there, as well as exactly a year ago being on the ground with our teams, over 95% of the population in urgent need of assistance. We talk about assistance, Peter. It's also your professionals who do have jobs. You find them also waiting in the queues, waiting for bread. We've been active on the ground for the last number of years. And if you think of a country that's ravaged by 4 decades of conflict, this is the end result, sadly to say, that you find many homes, Peter, that most of the homes are headed by orphans or widows and with no male figures. And 95% of the population in urgent need of assistance. Many a time you find people coming from the villages, coming to Kabul or the Kandahar or Mazar Sharif, to the major cities. And there's overcrowding and overburdening a city area, which is not coping already with the population. And like your report said earlier, it's a dire need. And this year, their numbers are expected to increase, Peter.
Who are you finding are the most vulnerable at this time?
Well, in any conflict situation, Peter, it's the widows, it's the orphans. I've sat with families. If I share each story more heart-wrenching than the next. Every home I sat with over the last 2 weeks in my time in Afghanistan, it's only widows and orphans, and there's no male figure, there's no father figure, and the end result is the widow and the children are left to fend for themselves, to either pay the rent for the small block that they're staying in, or to put food on the table. And sometimes they're left into a vulnerable situation, Peter, when it comes to paying the rent. They are taken advantage of. Unfortunately, there are some elements in the society that take advantage of the woman when it comes to the ladies paying the rent or putting food on the table. As you know, Afghanistan being predominantly a Muslim country, the month of Ramadan just started, especially in that part of the world yesterday, and you find that many of them not really looking forward towards the month, in the sense that they're not going to have any means to start the fast with, and not have any means to break the fast when the sun goes down. And that's the sad reality of the situation. You meet 13-year-old boys, you meet 10-year-old boys, you meet 6-year-old boys, and what they do on a daily basis, Peter, is that they walk the streets. And the visuals are showing on screen. I think there was a visual there of fermented bread. And so some of the families keep the bread that they get and they store it away because they're not sure where the next meal is going to come from. And so they keep the bread, even though it's fermented, they'll use it 2 or 3 days later, dip it with some water and have it as a meal. That shows you the dire situation, Peter, on the ground right now. When mothers are feeding their children with fermented, rotten bread because they're not sure where the next meal is going to come from. You meet children who cry and say they just want to be kids. They don't want to walk the streets, sell, beg, or work at 6 years old. They just want to be a kid or go to school. So an education system is also being affected because young children, 7, 8, 9, and 10, are not getting a chance at education. Why? Because they have to work the streets and then come back and help their mothers pay for the rent or put food on the table, Peter.
I read a report which says that 13,700 newborn babies and 26 mothers have died because of a lack of nutrition. This is essentially starving to death.
Absolutely, Peter. We met so many families. You meet expectant mothers who are about to give birth, living on the top of the mountains in Kabul, and you realize, somebody may ask, well, why are you staying on top of the mountain? Well, it's cheaper to stay on top of the mountain. It's less rental. But to get down the mountain, perhaps will take you an hour over rugged terrain, over the sewage lines, and to get any form of assistance, whether it be medical or any other assistance, number one, it'll take you a lot of time, a lot of expense, but also seen as a luxury, Peter. When you consider and you think about the primary focus of families is to pay the rent and to put food on the table, just to get bread. When we talk about food, Peter, perhaps it sounds a bit luxurious. We're not talking about your beans or maize or flour. We're talking just about bread. Is a basic necessity. Is a struggle every day. So when you meet mothers who perhaps are expecting, or mothers who have medical challenges, that gets left behind because why? Their primary focus is to feed their families. So like you correctly mentioned, as a result, you find many mothers losing their children. There's no proper medical care. They are unable to afford the medical treatment that may exist at the hospitals around the city.
I know that your work is as a humanitarian and that you're not a political analyst, but perhaps you can help us understand what has happened. Has it been like this for a while, even before the Taliban took over, or is it a situation that's been exacerbated as a result of asset freezes outside the country by the West?
Well, Peter, it's been like this. If you think of a country that's been hit by 4 decades of conflict, it's been like last year before the Taliban rule, we were in the country. Our teams are there. They're permanently based. We're working on the ground, and the situation was the same. Yes, now since the assets, so to speak, of those who are in charge of the country are frozen, just makes a rather desperate situation more worse. You think about, the families already, like we mentioned, Peter, with our teams on the ground, we're talking about professionals who are waiting in bread lines to receive bread, professionals who have jobs and are waiting in the bread line to receive bread. It tells you the desperation of the people and the dire need. So yes, to answer your question, Peter, the situation has been like this before the current regime, but it's definitely gotten worse since the economy has completely collapsed over the last few months.
I'm told that just 13% of the funding required has come through. Why isn't there much more coming through? Is it because of other conflicts, Ukraine getting the lion's share of attention now, or what's going on?
In any conflict zone, I suppose, Peter, it's what's highlighted, I suppose, in the media space. And yes, we know the conflict happening in the European part of the world with Russia and Ukraine, and a lot of media attention there. But we find this many a time where what's highlighted gets seen to. Afghanistan being one of the countries at the moment, I suppose the humanitarian crisis has not been highlighted to such a degree of the desperation that's on the ground or relevant to the situation on the ground. The African Muslims Agency teams have been there for the past number of years. I just been there 2 weeks ago, Peter, and personally seeing the situation, going into the homes, climbing the mountains, staying with the families, interacting with them, meeting with the relevant authorities of different people of different cultures, different backgrounds, and you get the first-hand knowledge of what's it like on the ground, and you realize that, as we heard the UN chief speaking about 95%, and we think about the months to come, it's only going to get worse unless there's a massive, massive contribution. We talk about the Afghan pledge that just happened about 2 days ago, 3 days ago, or the past week, where countries have come forward to pledge humanitarian aid. And yes, it may alleviate the situation, but much more is needed on the ground from all levels. One is a country with no infrastructure. Peter, I put you into a picture. Climbing a mountain, you have hundreds of homes, there's no water source. People are using the surface water of wastewater or sewage to utilize for consumption. That already tells you a already sad, depressing situation. And that's why the need, not just for food, but to create infrastructure of boreholes and water supply projects that at least brings dignity back to the families on the ground.
How difficult is it to reach people in need? I suppose those in the larger cities, you can get to them, but there must be millions in rural areas, in far-flung areas that just can't be reached at this time.
Well, obviously, there's, in the cities, there's this major mass of people that have come through to the cities seeking assistance, trying to find any other space they can on the mountains of Kabul. With the African Muslims Agency teams, with the AMA teams, we're able to access the various suburbs and districts around Kabul. But on my recent trip there, like I mentioned 2 weeks ago, we were able to move out into the out of Kabul, about an hour and a half drive, out of Kabul, perhaps 100 kilometers, 150 kilometers out to the actual villages and interact with the families and assist them in terms of their needs. I suppose into the absolute remote areas on the borders of Afghanistan may be challenging. Yes, you have your necessary roadblocks, your checkpoints. That's all around the city and all around the routes, wherever you go. But in a country like Afghanistan, it is needed. And I suppose they're only there to do their job in terms of protect the people of the country. But we were able to reach many, many villages. And we talk about the Ramadan season. As Ramadan, the month has started yesterday, we can understand the need on the ground. The teams are already busy, but not only busy in Kabul. Just this afternoon, I've seen reports coming out of Mazar Sharif, where our teams were able to facilitate many a program for the people there.
I suppose perhaps as we wrap up, I guess the international community need to be able to separate whatever feelings they might have about the Taliban and some of its policies and the people on the ground who are literally just victims of the situation they find themselves in.
Absolutely, Peter. It's a humanitarian issue, like Ukraine, like the other countries that are suffering conflict at the moment. It's a humanitarian issue. People on the ground are suffering. When you sit with an orphan child, who's 6 years old, who has no father, no guide for the rest of his life, and all he has is tears. He cannot get one word out, and he just wants to be a child and fears for his future. Fears in the sense that he does not want to beg or walk the streets, but just wants to go to school and get an education. You realize it's a humanitarian issue, irrespective of race, color, religion. And, as humanitarians, we can be humanitarians first and assist those in need, especially at the time of need, and alleviate the situation and at least bring some sort of dignity to the families, irrespective of which country they're from, which religion they follow. But we can be humanitarians to assist families across the globe.
Hassan, thank you so much indeed for joining us, and thank you for the work that you're doing as well. We hope that the people of Afghanistan get the urgent need that they help, and it is a pretty desperate situation, so let's hope the message gets through. But thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having us, Peter.